Imagine having to share your most vital, life-sustaining resource with your absolute worst enemy. Pretty wild, right? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating journey. We're going to start with a macro view of the intractable, decades-long rivalry between India and Pakistan, and then zoom all the way in to a highly specific, incredibly high-stakes dispute over water. So let's just dive right in. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, the roots of rivalry. Then, strategies and high stakes. After that, we'll look at the actual mechanics of the Indus Waters Treaty, and finally, wrap up with contemporary water conflicts. This dense history perfectly sets up our deep dive into the modern crisis, so let's get to it. All right, Section 1, the roots of rivalry. To really grasp the water conflicts we see today, we've got to set the clock back to the bitter 1947 Partition. This event separated these two nations amidst mass migration and, frankly, horrendous violence. But you see, the partition wasn't just drawing lines on a map. It arose from fundamentally contrasting concepts of national identity. On one side, India's post-colonial identity embraced a secular approach, aiming to include diverse religious and social groups. On the flip side, Muhammad Ali Jinnah championed the creation of Pakistan specifically as a dedicated political space for Muslims. So the very foundations of these two nations were built on contrasting ideas, perfectly setting up this massive ideological tug-of-war right from day one. And you can see the immediate fallout of those contrasting identities right here on this timeline. From the initial conflict, literally right at partition in 1947, to a second major war in 1965, the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, and all the way to the Kargil crisis in 1999. We're not going to get bogged down in the military minutiae here, but the takeaway is that this hasn't just been some background political disagreement. It's been a persistent, deeply rooted, kinetic conflict spanning over half a century. So what does this all mean for Kashmir? Well, Kashmir essentially became the ultimate focal point of this identity struggle. It's a parallel claim. It's claimed by Pakistan because it's a Muslim-majority territory, which, as we just saw, aligns perfectly with their foundational identity. But India claims it for precisely the exact same underlying reason. Retaining a Muslim-majority area validates its secular accommodation, so it's this deeply personal, almost mirror-image claim for both nations.
Moving on to Section 2, Strategies and High Stakes.
Over the years, to navigate this intractable rivalry, India has attempted a few distinct policy options against a revisionist Pakistan. First is defeat, involving reactive and proactive military action. Second is contain, meaning direct military deterrence and indirect power balancing. Then we have negotiate, which is exploring political solutions, though interestingly, making deals was often interpreted as a sign of weakness. And finally, concede, which, remained a strictly unexercised, purely theoretical option. Now, this external conflict is inextricably tied to how both countries evolved internally. Over the decades, India gradually consolidated into a relatively stable, status quo participatory democracy. Pakistan, meanwhile, faced internal struggles, and as a result, its military became deeply entrenched in politics. And that military developed a vested interest in sustaining hostility with India, basically to justify its own dominance. Two very different political systems, shaping two very contrasting worldviews. But then, the strategic landscape changed overnight. Rivals with nuclear weapons must cooperate to avoid war. That profound, sobering realization hit hard during the 1999 Kargil crisis and the intense standoff between 2001 and 2002. Getting nuclear weapons essentially forced both rivals to rethink everything. The risks were just too catastrophic for all-out war. It was an absolute game-changer, pushing both sides to pivot toward back-channel diplomacy just to keep a lid on things. Okay, let's pivot. Section 3, the Indus Waters Treaty. We're zooming down from macro geopolitics to the vital, life-sustaining waters of the Indus River. Just take a look at the massive geographic spread of the rivers on this map. It's like a giant puzzle. Back in 1960, a landmark treaty brokered by the World Bank physically divided this incredibly complex river basin right between the two nations. Let's break down the actual math here, because it's absolutely crucial. The treaty allocated the western rivers, that's the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, to Pakistan. That represents a massive annual flow of about 232.5 cubic kilometers of water. That is enough to fill a lot of swimming pools. Meanwhile, the eastern rivers, the Ravi, Bias, and Sutlej, were allocated to India, which is about 11 cubic kilometers. Just think about that contrast, 232.5 versus 11. It perfectly highlights Pakistan's sheer reliance on those western rivers. Now, for the eastern rivers, India has unrestricted use of all that water. But wait, here's where it gets super technical and really interesting. The treaty actually grants India some specific vital exceptions on Pakistan's allocated western rivers. India is permitted domestic use, like drinking and sanitation. It gets non-consumptive use, so navigation and flood control. Agricultural use for irrigation is allowed. And crucially, it can generate run-of-the-river hydroelectric power. However, and this is a huge, bold print caveat, the treaty explicitly bans India from building large water storage projects on those western rivers. Since we're dealing with such strict technical rules, the treaty was brilliantly designed with a 3-tiered dispute resolution mechanism to de-escalate conflicts technically. It goes like this. Questions are handled by the Permanent Indus Commission. If those escalate to differences, they go to a neutral expert. And if they boil over into full-blown disputes, they get kicked up to a court of arbitration. The whole point was to keep human emotions out of the water supply. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Contemporary Water Conflicts. So how is that technical system holding up today? Well, the deep historical mistrust we talked about earlier is heavily testing those mechanics. Just look at these tangible, modern flashpoints. You've got the Kishinganga and Rodal hydro projects, where they literally couldn't even agree on whether to use the neutral expert or the court of arbitration. Pakistan is disputing the Pakal Dul and Lower Kolnai hydropower plants. And India has raised major red flags over Pakistan's blockade of the Fazilka drain, which caused contamination in Indian border areas. Real-world friction at every turn. And this brings our story full circle. India is frustrated because, while the treaty technically allows some storage under exceptional circumstances, they feel Pakistan deliberately blocks these permissible projects purely out of political rivalry. But Pakistan, on the other hand, harbors deep suspicion. They look at India trying to utilize every inch of the treaty's breathing space, and they worry, naturally leading them to scrutinize every technicality to suspend Indian projects. So what you have is a highly technical, math-based treaty completely overwhelmed by sheer political mistrust. So where do we go from here? Well, recently, an Indian parliamentary committee noted that India currently underutilizes its share of the western rivers for irrigation, and there are growing calls to maximize permissible storage and hydropower. But guys, there is a massive shadow looming over all of this: climate change. Remember, the Indus Waters Treaty was framed back in the 1960s. It was based entirely on the technology of dams and canals. It completely fails to account for global warming or changing environmental impacts. To put that in perspective, we have a treaty governing water for millions that doesn't even factor in melting glaciers. Which leads us to a really powerful question. Can a treaty built for the 1960s survive the 21st century realities of climate change and deep historical mistrust? It's a precarious situation and a stark reminder that even the best engineered treaties can dry up if the political climate changes. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.